Hi, welcome to Virginia Time Travel, your portal to the Commonwealth's past, present, and future. During the American Civil War, there were over 400 battles and skirmishes in the state of Virginia. Many of them happened right here in our own Northern Virginia. Our guests today are two of the most preeminent Civil War historians in our area, award-winning authors and filmmakers, Chuck Mauro and Don Hakenson. And they're here to tell us about the guerrilla leader, John Singleton Mosby, who was involved in many of the actions right here in River City. So welcome to the show, guys.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you.
Okay, so, you know, this is a diverse area, and a lot of people aren't history wonks. And so who exactly was John Singleton Mosby?
Well, John Singleton Mosby was a very interesting figure. He didn't have a military background, and he started out as a private. But he would convince Jeb Stuart into making him or giving him a partisan unit starting in January of 1863. And for 2.5 years, he would become a thorn in the side of the Union cavalry and infantry here in Northern Virginia. And he would become a legend. And the U.S. Army and the U.S. Marine Corps still study his tactics today, 150 years later, because what are we fighting in Afghanistan and Iraq? Guerrilla warfare. So it's kind of interesting that an individual who fought 150 years ago, his tactics are still relevant today. And that's why it's important to know about John Singleton Mosby and Mosbys Rangers.
Okay.
Another interesting aspect of Mosby was that the day after Virginia voted to secede, May 23, 1861, President Lincoln sent Union troops into Alexandria and into Northern Virginia. And so for the first year or so of the war, the area was actually controlled by Confederates after the first Battle of Manassas. The Confederates moved into Falls Church and Vienna and the areas of Fairfax County. Then they pulled out in the spring of 1862. But Mosby, once he got his partisan Rangers, he operated in and around, all through Northern Virginia, attacking the supplies lines, the communication lines. And aside from his military aspects, he was a savior to the Southerners that lived in Northern Virginia, and he was feared by the civilians on the northern side, because we had plenty of both here during the war.
Now you mentioned the word partisan Rangers. Now, what exactly is a partisan Ranger?
Well, a partisan Ranger is I guess you could say another term would be a guerrilla. They operated behind enemy lines. They conducted search and destroy. If you wanted to use today's terms for the military today, they would hit the enemy at any turn and try to cause as much problems to the Union Army behind enemy lines and keep as many troops guarding Washington City and away from Robert E. Lee in the field.
So were they uniformed troops?
They were uniformed. They were sanctioned Confederate soldiers, but they had a different type of mission, and that was to operate behind enemy lines and hit quickly and then disappear into the mist.
Okay.
Well, and they operated, as Don mentioned, under the Partisan Ranger Act, which is really a naval act which allowed soldiers on ships to capture another ship and keep the spoils. And they just really applied that type of logic to Mosby and his men, and then he would attack the Union soldiers. They could keep personal things they took, but they would turn over horses and equipment to the Southern Army as well.
Well, see, that's interesting because I've read Union officers referring to Mosby's men as pirates, and so I didn't understand where they were getting this pirate.
Sure.
So that's
and
interesting.
they were called bushwhackers and thieves too. You know?
Okay.
And sometimes they were called featherbed Rangers because they actually stayed in homes, in safe houses located in Fauquier.
Well,
and
see, now
Loudoun
this
County.
is interesting because, you know, presumably these were kind of young military-age guys, and I mean, wouldn't the Union soldiers have said, well, how come this young guy isn't off fighting with the Confederacy? I mean, it seems like they'd be pretty easy to spot, no?
No. very difficult. A lot of Mosby's men were staying at safe houses, and a lot of them were staying at their own father's house, their own mother's house, their grandfather's, their aunts, their uncles, or very close friends. But there were networks that whenever the Union cavalry came into the area, these men would leave their houses and they would run out into the woods, and they had safe havens in the woods, and they would stay there until the Union troops left the area.
And see, that's a little hard to understand now because of all the development, but at the time, it was very rural. You know, when we talk about Mosby's Confederacy, so how big an area are we talking about here?
Well, there's a lot of people who have tried to define just what Mosby's Confederacy is. I'm going to tell you what Don Hakenson believes his Confederacy is. I believe parts of Fairfax County, Prince William County, Loudoun and Fauquier County, Rappahannock, Warren, and Clark County. He operated in those areas, and he had one of the largest areas of operations that any commander could ever have, and he was so effective in causing problems to the Union Army.
What was also interesting is Mosby had a number of companies, and some of the captains of these companies operated independently. So Mosby's men would be out and about everywhere throughout the area that Don just spoke. Mosby always got blamed himself, although he was never with every specific raid or attack.
So how many men are we talking about that he commanded at any given point in time?
Well, I'm going to tell you, he started out with 9 men, then it became 15 men, then it became a company. The majority of the raids that he would conduct would be anywhere from 25 to 50 men. The most men he ever had in any one raid was anywhere from 350 to 400 men. The most men he ever had under his command was 800 men. But when they tabulated everybody that rode on raids for that 2.5-year period, you had a lot of cavalry men who would come and join Mosby, go out in the raid, get themselves a horse so they could go back to their active duty unit, or the regular cavalry unit, and it totaled up to around 2,000 men. So there was a lot of different cavalrymen that rode with John Singleton Mosby.
Interesting. So, we've alluded to him running around, pinning down the 30,000 troops around Washington. What were some of his most noteworthy exploits?
Well, there's no doubt about it. I think he had probably one of the singular achievements in the war when he went into Fairfax Courthouse and he captured Brigadier General Edwin H. Stoughton. That raid really put him on the map. And then right after that, he had the St. Patrick's Day raid in Herndon, and that became a very successful raid. And then he had a big victory at Miskel's Farm. And then in 1864, he was involved in a fight against the 2nd Massachusetts Cavalry at Mount Zion Church. And that was another huge victory. But he also had some raids in which he was not successful, but those are probably 4 of his most famous raids.
And, when I said that you guys were preeminent Civil War historians, you're not just in the library, you're out in the field. And in your new book, Mosby's Combat Operations in Loudoun County, you cover how many sites, did you say?
Well, in the Loudoun County book, we cover over 100 sites where Mosby had raids, and today where some of his men are buried. In our Fairfax County book, we have over 90 sites.
And that's a companion book to the Loudoun book. And you have how many sites in?
Over 100. And the way we actually write the books is Don and I sit down and make a list of sites that we start by making a list of the sites and then going out and photographing the sites. And Don and I get in the car and we just spend day after day driving. And on a good day, we might hit 30, 40 sites. On some days, it's only like 12 to 25. But we drive to each site, we note the location, we put the GPS locations, we get out and photograph them. And then once we've got our list pretty well complete for a particular county, then we sit down and start writing all the stories that go along with each of those sites and whatever happened at those locations.
So for 200 sites, how do you begin tabulating? You go to the official records, or how did you come up with all of the different skirmish sites? Because I imagine some of them were like running skirmishes, some of them probably weren't that big.
We're pretty lucky a large number of Mosbys Rangers were highly educated men. And a lot of these men wrote memoirs and they wrote books after the war. And Mosby wrote several books. He wrote lots of newspaper articles, and he also wrote magazine articles. And when you take all that information, you can actually come up with a listing of the places they were engaged in, how the fight occurred, how it ended up. We're really lucky that there were so many people that wrote about their time writing with John Singleton Mosby, that it has really helped Chuck and I a great deal in putting together our books. And
there are many books written about Mosby and about his raids. And what Don just didn't say is that he got interested in Mosby by going on Mosby tours with some of the people that we both respect. And then Don probably, for the past 15, 20 years, has been leading these tours himself. So when we go out, like I said, we'd have a list of sites. Some days we don't even get to site number 1. Don will say, oh, let's go in this direction, or let's go over here. And because Don has been leading these tours, he knows where these sites are, even if it's just a little spot here or a little spot there.
I think it's very important. I'm glad that Chuck brought up that there were several other men that also conducted the tours before me. Jim Moyer and Tom Evans, who I think are the people that really motivated me into wanting to learn more about Mosby and his combat operations. They conducted the Mosby tours for 19 years. And I was fortunate enough to know both of them, become friends with both of them, and to learn from their experience and their knowledge and what they had learned while they were doing the tours. Very beneficial.
Now, I know that Mosby spent a lot of time attacking the railroads. And I remember reading that the Union Army had actually put civilians as human shields to protect railways from Mosby's raiders. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, I can tell you that they attempted to do it, but Mosby decided they were still military targets. He knew that there was Confederates on those trains, and it did not stop him from conducting his operations. Mm-hmm. They were hoping that it would, but Mosby was a man that understood that he had a mission to do, and he couldn't stop the mission based on knowing that his men were aboard those trains. Okay. It's really documented that one of his men actually died from one of the engagements they were involved in.
You know, we've talked about perhaps as many as 2,000 people over the course of the war being Rangers. So what was it like to be a Mosby Ranger? I get up tomorrow morning and I'm a Mosby Ranger. What's my day going to be like?
Well, I tell you what, it was an adventurous life. You've got to think about it. Every time you went out on a raid with John Singleton Mosby, you were putting your life in his hands. A lot of times he didn't even tell them where they were going. But they knew that with him in the lead, there was going to be some fighting. And Mosby always led from the front, so he had the leadership qualities to inspire his men. And so they knew that when they went out on a raid with Mosby, they better have their revolvers ready for action, because there was going to be firing and there was going to be killing. There was no other way to say it.
There's another aspect of this to your question. As Don has said, a lot of these men lived at home or in safe houses, and they lived among the civilian population. But who was the civilian population at the time? Most of the men, whether you're Northern or Southern, had run off and were part of the regular army. So who was left at home guarding their homes? It was the women. And there were a lot of women, and what happened during the war, if you left your property, either in a command of Union soldiers or Southern soldiers came by, first thing they would do was come in the house to see if there was any food. And if there was nobody home, they'd take whatever they wanted from the house. If they were building huts, if it was in the winter, they just tear the houses down and take whatever they wanted. So the women stayed behind in their homes in order to protect them. One of the women that we write about in the Fairfax County book was a woman named Laura Ratcliffe. And she lived over on Centerville Road, just south of Herndon. And after the First Battle of Drainesville, she had tended to some of Jeb Stuart's wounded men over at Frying Pan Church, which is still there today. So Jeb Stuart was kind of captivated by her, and in one of his raids, he came by her house to check on her with John Singleton Mosby. And this was early, actually in December of 1862. And it was actually when Jeb Stuart and John Mosby were at her house and getting ready to leave that Laura says to General Stuart, you know, please don't leave us alone. We're all alone here in enemy territory. And on December 22nd, 1862, he says, well, I intend to leave Captain Mosby behind with a few men to look after the good Southern people in this section. And it's the very next day that Mosby gets his first 9 men that became part of his guerrilla Rangers. Mm-hmm. But throughout the rest of the war, the interesting thing was Mosby knew who was a Southerner and who was a Northerner. Everybody did. And he would stop at the Southerners' homes for information. I mean, he could go to Laura's house, who was on Centerville Road, and ask her who's been by. And she was a smart lady that could go out and find out who the Union soldiers were, where they were going. She was even accused by the Union soldiers of knowing the picket duty. But he would stop by for information, he would stop by for food, and he'd also stop by to rest from time to time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's one thing that people forget, that Northern Virginia was definitely a no man's land. You had Southerners and Northerners all kind of mixed in together.
That's true. It was actually called the debatable land by some of the people. It was debatable whether it was northern area or southern area.
One of the things that's particularly interesting is the age of some of these soldiers. Now, I've seen a picture of a young man who's 16, but he looks like he's about 13 years old. And I know that there were a number of what we would now call child soldiers who rode. So what was the deal with this?
I tell you what, there was a large number of Rangers that served with John Singleton Mosby that was 12 years old, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. And someone asked John Singleton Mosby after the war, why were you so successful? Was it because so many officers resigned their commission and rode with you? And he said, no. He said, I had these young men that rode with me, and they would do whatever I told them to do. And that was one of the reasons that Mosby felt that he was so successful, is that they followed orders, even though they were very, very young men. I'm a Vietnam era veteran, and I went in at 18 years old. And there was a lot of debate about whether 17 was too young, and he had men way younger than 17 years old.
Yeah. Well, you know, I think one of the things about Mosby, because he certainly was dashing, and you get this cavalier thing, but war is a nasty business, and Mosby himself never romanticized his role, which I think is interesting. But, you know, there are, you know, the Laura Radcliffe, the spy, and all the rest of it. So, but it was a dirty and nasty business. So what other personalities were outstanding that you might want to mention in regard to Mosby?
Well, I tell you what, Mosby, he held his command together with an iron fist. And when he said something, you better obey it. And if you missed 2 meetings, you were sent back to the regular army. So he had a lot of control. And when he created a company, and Chuck knows this very well, he would nominate the 4 officers, and he would send word out that if you went against what he said, he would send you back to the regular army. These guys did not want to go back to the regular army. They were living in homes. Yeah. And they were actually bringing stuff back to the people in the homes they were staying in. It might have been their own relatives. So they didn't want to leave Mosby's command. But Mosby himself was not a fun-loving type of guy. He was mission-oriented. He was very serious, and he held that command with an iron fist. There's no doubt about it.
Well, when I say that, you know, it was a nasty business, I mean, let's talk about later in the war. And I know some people even today blame Mosby for what happened to a lot of the civilians. There was the burning raid. What was the burning raid?
Well, the burning raid, especially, there's 2 different types. There's the burning raid out in the valley, and then there's the burning raid by General Merritt and Sheridan to get rid of Mosby. And that occurred from the 28th of November to the 2nd of December of 1864. And what they were really trying to do was wipe out Mosby, find all his hiding places, destroy all his foodstuffs. But it didn't work. And it really caused more harm to the civilians than it did to Mosby and his men.
Mm-hmm.
We have some pictures of some of the mills that were burned in Loudoun County in our book. Potts Mill and the Sally's Mill, some of them out Route 50. You know, one of the interesting things about doing books like this is that everybody drives by these locations every day. And there are no statues or there's no, signs up. We've got over 100 locations in Loudoun County itself. And through our research and expertise, we know where a lot of these places are, and we've been fortunate enough to get permission even to go on private property to take pictures of some of these locations. Even gotten in some of the houses that Mosby was in, during the war, and take pictures in there as well.
I'm glad you brought up that it was serious business, because it's about killing people. that may be a sad thing to say, but that's what it was about. And it was getting people to surrender. And whatever Mosby had to do, he would do.
Now, are there places that people can visit, public places? I mean, you've got 200 sites that you mentioned. How many of those are accessible to the public?
I would say a majority of them are. In the book, we note where, this is a private residence. But in most cases with those private residences, you can at least drive up. We've got the addresses, we've got the GPS locations in the book. You can drive up and you can see it from afar. Don mentioned Miskell's Farm, where he was one of Mosby's most famous successes. This was early in his career. He did not send pickets out. And the story was that he was asleep in front of the fireplaces when the Yankees rode up, and his men had to be roused out of bed, and he was fortunate to escape. But we happen to know the owner of Miskell's Farm today, so we actually got in to take pictures. And I got a picture of the fireplace that Mosby actually slept in. So in most of the cases, you have the pictures in the book, so you know when you get there that, okay, that's where it happened. And if it's a private residence and you can't get in, at least we've got pictures from inside the house that you can look at.
Mm-hmm. What's really easy is if you go down Route 50, you got Mount Zion Church. Anybody can pull in and pull into the parking lot and walk around the church. Well, there was a fight there, and Mosby's men engaged the 2nd Massachusetts Cavalry, and quite a few men of the 2nd Mass were killed there. But now there's a lot of plaques that talk about the fighting there, and that makes it really unique and really worthwhile for people who want to follow what's went on in the book. Mm-hmm. And what Mosby's men did at that church house.
Now the book is available online, is that right?
Sure, it's available on Amazon, eBay, and we have our own website.
You have your own website, and
yeah.
We're going to put that up for the folks. So, now Mosby's Confederacy was more than Loudoun and Fairfax. So, are you working on other counties now, or?
Well, we're in the process of doing a book on Fauquier County. I think we probably visited a good 70, 80 locations.
Wow.
We're filming this just at the end of winter. We're waiting for it to get a little bit warmer, and then we'll be going back out again and finishing up the locations, and then we'll get ready to start writing. So
how long does it take you to do one of these books?
Probably a couple years. From the time we start, as I said, the process is we make a list, we photograph, then we sit down and write the stories, and of course you have to edit the book and put it all together. So it takes a couple years.
Well, you must spend an awful lot of time in the field.
We do.
We spend an awful lot of time in the car with each other.
I tell you what, one thing about Chuck is a professional photographer. And that's why the pictures in our books are so professional looking and add a great deal to the narrative. When it's really hot, I stay in the car where the air conditioner is, and he's out there dying. And when it's cold, I stay in the car where it's nice and warm, and he still has to take the pictures. So he does a lot of sacrificing for the book.
It is interesting. Sometimes we will go out in the summer, and we'll drive up to a location, and John just goes, "Over there, Chuck," keep the car running.
Now, there is an association, the Mosby Heritage Association, and where are they located?
Go ahead.
Well, they're located what's called Atoka, or Rector's Crossroads. It's on Route 50. It's right on the border of Loudoun County and Fauquier County. It was established in 1995. I went to the very first meeting they ever had. And they've done a lot to promote Mosby's Confederacy and Mosby's operations.
And you asked earlier about going to sites. The Mosby Heritage normally has talks, at some of the sites, many of the sites where Mosby, fought, or houses that were there during the war. So you get the opportunity to actually go visit those sites.
And they have a museum. Where is that located?
Well, the Stuart Mosby Civil War Cavalry Museum is sponsored by the Stuart Mosby
Oh, I see.
Historical
So
Society.
they're different.
Different organization. However, they have a museum right there in Centerville. We have the sword that belonged to General Stoughton. We've got Mosby's 44. We have a sword that was surrendered to Jeb Stuart. So we have a lot of really nice stuff at the museum. I hope people will visit Centerville and see our little museum.
Great. Well, I want to thank you guys for sharing all of your labors, and we have a little present for you.
Oh, thank you.
Our latest book, Civil War Graves in
very
Northern
much.
Virginia. And I want to thank you for tuning in to Virginia Time Travel. This show is brought to you by a generous gift from the Margarita W. and Donald J. Metzger Endowment. And please contact us at www.timetravel21.com. Thanks a lot, and I'll see you next time.